Chapter 1 of Introduction to Human Geography is called Cultural Geography and Introduction. Very appropriate. This chapter will walk you through developing a framework of themes and a framework of terminology that we're going to use to understand the rest of the text. It's important that you begin to use and think about this vocabulary so that you can use it when you respond to a forum post or when you do some of the writings or reflections that you're going to be asked to use. And this is really building this common vocabulary that's used in all of geography in advanced level courses. So first, let's just start out by defining culture. So when I look at this man, I know that he's from South Korea. He was born in South Korea, and so you might have some assumptions about him. And this idea of culture is part of this continuum of geography. And so when I've asked this in class, what would you assume, or what were the assumptions you might make about this person? People say, he speaks Korean, or he speaks with an accent, he likes rice. There's a bunch of things because he's obviously physically Asian. But the reality is, this is my younger brother, and he was adopted into our family when he was 3 months old, so that his culture is 100% American. U.S. American. He speaks with the accent of the South because that's where he was raised, in Georgia. He likes hot dogs and hamburgers. He really doesn't like rice. And this just is to exemplify that culture is not something we're born with. Culture is an acquired set of behaviors and ideas. Our inherited traits are something completely different. There are maybe our personality, our temperament, our physical features. But culture, when we're talking about culture, we're going to be talking about the things that humans have acquired as a result often of where they live. We'll be looking at a lot of maps during the term, and here is a map showing hunger and food insecurity in the continent of Africa. And so the darker color are areas where there's a higher than expected rate of hunger and food insecurity. And so when we look at this, you wonder, is that food insecurity just a result of poverty, or is it a result of cultural issues? And in this case, the food insecurity is often a result of development and of colonization, and a culture that was interrupted in its own development. However, what's interesting is that often there have been many attempts to try and bring modern technology and food practices to some of the countries in Africa that are experiencing food insecurity. And so there's a map that shows major wheat production areas in the world. And so you see that there is no wheat production in very little wheat production in the continent of Africa. And so there was research done to bring the technology to enable people to grow wheat. And so they had climate that was right, they had soil that was right. And so the idea was, if we could just teach people how to grow wheat, we could end the hunger and food issues. However, what people have found is our food preferences are so strongly tied to our culture that people didn't want to eat wheat, even if they were told it would end the physical hunger in the area. That we're so tied into what our cultural norms are that it's hard to make those changes. So another major issue in the text is this idea of cultural regions. And there are 3 kinds of regions you need to be able to define and discuss. There's formal regions, vernacular regions, and functional regions. And regions are just artificial ways that humans have developed to group areas based on certain criteria so that they can be discussed and compared and maybe better understood. So we're going to start with a very silly example of formal regions. So let's say I do a survey in a small community and I go house to house and I ask people if they like okra. And if they like okra, I color the house dot blue. And so I end up with this dot map showing houses where people like okra and houses where people don't like okra. And so I could draw a circle kind of around the concentration of okra lovers. And so this could be a formal region. So this would be the region of the city or the town where okra is adored. And what you find with a formal region is that there's a core. So in the middle of this region is where you're going to find the most frequency or the most common okra lovers. And as you move away from the core to the periphery, you find fewer and fewer okra lovers. So that's one way a formal region is defined. These borders I drew with my pen. They're not hard and fast borders. You don't go from here to here and go from okra lovers to no okra lovers, and you can see that that border is kind of artificial, but it's there just to help define a region. And I can complicate matters by going back to the same people and finding people who like opera. And so I could then draw a circle or a region of opera lovers in this town. And you can see that the core of the opera lovers is about here. And as I move away from the core, I have fewer and fewer opera lovers. And so now I have two formal regions on my map, and I could go even a third step and I could find opera lovers. And so if I end up with a core of people who like opera and a core of people who like opera and a core of people who like okra, where these areas combine could be another formal region. And that's just an extremely silly way to show you the illustration in the map. So formal regions are based on traits like language, like religion, maybe buying habits or shopping habits or TV watching habits, or the way that people pronounce certain words. Those are all traits, cultural traits that can be used to form regions. And so this is the same example of my opera, and okra. So here's an example of a map of the world showing formal regions. And each of these colored images is a different religion. And so the predominant religion in South America is Catholic Christianity. It doesn't mean that I will never find anybody who practices another religion in that area, but that's the dominant trait. If I go to the United States, then the prominent religion is Protestant Christianity, and actually I think it's Baptist, which doesn't mean that there aren't any Catholics. But what that does mean is that the core of Protestant Christianity is probably somewhere in the middle of the United States, and as I move north to Canada, I'm going to run into more and more prevalence of Catholic Christianity, and as I move south, I'm going to run into more and more prominence of Catholics. So formal regions have a core, a periphery. They have very diffuse borders. Here's another example of formal regions of vegetation. So you can see that the lines have been drawn, but the lines are really pretty artificial. This says extreme desert, but my guess is I might be able to find some patches of extreme desert down in the semi-arid area. And I also might find some grass extruding up into the semi-desert. But if I'm in the middle of the Sahara, I'm probably pretty much 100% desert. And then as I move away to the periphery, I'm going to see other traits. The second type of border is a functional border. And functional regions. Functional regions have developed to address some function. And in this way, the borders that are drawn are hard and fast. So these are political functional regions, so countries, and I can either be in the United States or not in the United States in just just a hair width of a line across these two countries. And although the line is artificial in the sense that there is no physical well, sometimes there's a physical line that could be a fence or something. But anyway, in general, these lines were drawn by humans to separate territory into areas that function. Each functional region has a node where decisions are made. So for the United States, the node would be Washington, D.C. For Canada, the node would be Ottawa. And then you could even break it down into states, and each state would function as a functional region, and each state would have a capital, and that capital would be a node. You could even look at it on a much smaller scale. So here's one, I think the book has or did have, of farm areas. And so each land ownership parcel would be part of a functional region, and the farmhouse would be the node where the decisions are made. And here's another example of functional regions of federal district courts. And so this blue area on the west of the United States is Federal District 9. And so all of these borders, if you commit a crime in Utah, even if it's on 1 inch over the border into Utah, you don't go to District 9, you would have to go to District 10. So functional regions, much different than formal regions. And the third type of region are vernacular regions. And vernacular regions are, they're kind of fun, and they're a little difficult to describe because they just exist in people's belief system. And so in Southern Oregon, Northern California, there's an area of those two states that they consider themselves a separate region, the state of Jefferson. And so you might see state of Jefferson shirts. Here's state of Jefferson toilet paper. Dixie is another famous vernacular regions. People who name their stores Dixie, they live in Dixie, on and on. And even in Oregon, the Beavers area in northern Oregon, and the Ducks in the southern area or the central area could be vernacular regions. Another large topic that's going to be discussed in this chapter is diffusion. And diffusion is the way that ideas and materials and people move from one area to the other of the world. So when we look at the world right now, actually this is so outdated because iPods are kind of passé and everybody has iPhones or Android phones. I was in Turkey this summer and it was just amazing how many people are technologically wired. So there's two major types of diffusion. One is relocation diffusion, the other is expansion diffusion, and there are two types of expansion diffusion. And this map does, or this little drawing does a great job of showing how expansion diffusion moves, or information moves. Contagious diffusion moves like a disease or like an infection. So the black dot represents the original knower, and let's say I develop a way to clean my sink that no one's ever thought of, and I show my neighbors and they show their neighbors, and it moves just kind of like a wave. And this is the way fads will often spread from one small place to the next door neighbors. And later down the road you see that everybody now is practicing this new intervention. Hierarchical diffusion, however, has more of a leapfrogging motion. So it moves from an important person or place to another important person or place. So it will skip over small cities. A great example of that would be fashion. So here's Paris fashions, and they might move from Paris to New York, but you're not going to see them on the streets of in West Virginia for several years, if ever. In fact, when I was in Europe several years ago, I noticed that we were wearing things that people said they had been wearing years before. So even Eugene has much lower rates of diffusion. The second type, relocation diffusion, involves people actually moving from one place to the other. So they take their culture with them or their idea with them. And so it often doesn't result in more people practicing or using an innovation. It just means that the innovation or the idea is used in a new place. And so the whole idea is the number of knowers does not increase. So that's the idea of diffusion. With expansion diffusion, one of the things that you'll see is called an acceptance curve or a time distance decay, so that often if you look at time on the x-axis and the number of people who are practicing innovation on the y-axis, in the beginning it's kind of a gentle slope as more and more people over time begin to practice an idea. So let's just think about the hula hoop. So in the beginning, a few people were using the hula hoop, and then all of a sudden it just caught on, and more people are using the hula hoop. And then it starts to flatten out. So as more people already are practicing it, there aren't new people, and it also, the fad kind of it just kind of lives its life. And so look at that time distance decay graph a little bit. So some examples then of innovation is looking at the printing press. So this would be a great example of hierarchical diffusion, where the printing press moved from big cities in the beginning, from one big city to the next big city, then to medium-sized city, and then down to smaller cities. The expansion of hip-hop would be the same. Hip-hop started, there's some discussion of starting it in Detroit, but I don't think so. I think it was in the Bronx in the 70s and moved to some of the local larger cities and then filtered back finally to Eugene, Oregon. Anyway. And then the last type of diffusion is stimulus diffusion. So we have, this is kind of not in that the graph. So these were expansion, relocation, and stimulus. So there really are three kinds of diffusion. And stimulus diffusion is where the idea is kept, the basic idea is kept, but the way that it's practiced or the way that an item is made is completely changed. And so here's an example of, I think it's a mandolin, and how when it was diffused to South America, the materials were completely different, and that so they kept the idea of the instrument, but changed it dramatically. And again, for relocation diffusion, this idea that the number of knowers doesn't increase, only the location of the knowers increases. So one of the things with diffusion is it doesn't always happen. There are barriers to diffusion. There's absolute barriers, or absorbing barriers to diffusion. Let me change that right now. Absorbing barriers to diffusion, and there's permeable barriers to diffusion. And absorbing barriers could be physical barriers like mountains, lakes, deserts, that could actually stop the transfer of information or people. Absorbing barriers can also be political policies. So the Taliban in Afghanistan blocked television advertising, radio, to keep modern popular culture from diffusing into the country. And then there are permeable barriers, and permeable barriers are a little bit like stimulus diffusion, where part of the idea gets through, maybe not all of the idea gets through. The other major topic is cultural ecology. And this is that human physical interaction. It's the discussion of how do people adapt their culture, and how does culture influence how people live in the world. And there are a couple theories or belief systems about cultural ecology. One is environmental determinism, the other is possibilism. So take a look at both of those. And they're pretty well described in the book. And environmental perceptions. Different cultures have beliefs in how they should view the environment, or the landscape. And when I was in Turkey, one of the things that I was reading was that in Islamic homes, keeping dogs inside was forbidden. However, people felt strongly that animals should be fed and taken care of, and so there were many dogs when Europeans entered into that region. Many dogs loose in the town, and it looked as if the animals were not being cared for, which wasn't true. But the culture, the European culture that came in, felt that these dogs were not being cared for, and so their idea was to put them down, which was a huge affront to the people that were caring for them. So just different ways that we view our environment or how we should interact with our environment can cause interesting results. One of the aspects in cultural ecology is seen in our housing, in our clothing, in our food, defenses, shelters. And so here are two thatch houses, both in Africa, but from different, slightly different needs, slightly different materials, but basically the same underlying idea. We'll also be looking at cultural landscape, the built landscape. We'll spend some time talking about urban environments and urbanization and cities. The world is getting much more urbanized. And so how are we dealing with that? What kind of impact is that having on our culture and on our environment? One of the things I asked you to talk about is this idea of a Latin city model, and how U.S. cities are different. And historically, in a Latin city, you have the central business district or the market in the middle of the city, and then you'll have a spine of elite living kind of along one aspect, and then often along the edges up in the hills are the areas of poverty. In Eugene, it seems to me that we traditionally have had the more affluent people living up in the hills and people of less influence kind of living on the edges or around downtown, although fuel prices seem to be changing some of that. One thing I want you to think about this week, and we'll look at it again when we look at agriculture, is the ways that we divide up land, the partitioning of land. And so there's three basic ways that you see on the landscape in the United States. One is the public land survey system, one is meets and bounds, and the third is the French long lot. And they each have a distinctive pattern of development. Here's a nice example showing the PLSS, irrigated and non-irrigated. Here is a meets and bounds in Germany. I don't even know the name of this system, but it makes a great image. And then in France, the French long lot. So I want you to be able to identify where those are in the United States and how they affect land development. And then the last topic, or second to the last topic, is this idea of location, which is really critical in geography. And so you want to be able to talk about location in two ways. One is relative location, the second is absolute location. Relative location means that you're discussing a place with respects to other places. So if I were talking about Lane Community College, I could say it's west of the Willamette River, north of Creswell, Oregon. I could say it is half a mile south of Highway 30. It's more of a quarter of a mile. So I could use all of those things, but those locations are only relative to other places. Absolute location would be the address. So the address is hard and fast for Lane. Doesn't matter where I'm standing or where I'm coming from. The address is the same. and latitude and longitude is another way that I can give you absolute location, or universal transmercator UTM coordinates. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I want you to be able to think about describing places using relative or absolute location. We'll be looking at a lot of maps that are a special type called a choropleth map, and this book has some bad examples of choropleth maps, and I will try to point those out, and it also has some good examples of choropleth maps. A choropleth map is a map where the color and the value are related, and so for example, in this map of showing the Human Development Index, countries that have the highest index, the highest number, are colored with the darkest blue color. Countries that have the lowest index are colored with the lightest blue color. And so with a choropleth map of the Human Development Index, I can easily look at the patterns and say, wow, there's a real northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere difference. Kind of the middle of the world along the equator in general has a lower Human Development Index than the northern or the most southern hemisphere. And I can also see that this part of Africa has the lowest Human Development Index. So one of the things with the Human Development Index is you could use this as a predictor for a lot of cultural needs and events. And so this is a composite index of life expectancy, of education, and of income. And so when you look at this, you could also think about human rights. You can think about gender differences or gender equity. These are all related in certain ways to the Human Development Index. But one of the things I wanted you to think about is how could using this map help you maybe think about areas where immigration and migration, refugees, where are they coming from and where would they be going? If you only had this map, how might you be able to use that to predict flow of people and maybe to explain why people might move from one area to the other? Okay, so that is chapter 1. As I said, it's a huge chapter, lots of terminology. I did not cover it all, but hopefully I got the gist of it for you. All right, so good luck on the exam, and I'm really excited to hear and to read your geo stories.